In October 1929, depositors lined outside New York banks and begged for money that no longer existed. Some carried wedding savings or business profits on small folded slips that showed balances which vanished overnight without explanation. Shutters rolled down across marble entrances, and police pushed people back, while managers escaped through side doors in silence. Within days, thousands of banks across America failed, and ordinary savers discovered that a bank balance is only a promise. Yet a minority of families still had spending power because they had never trusted that single promise with all their cash. They did not have secret insider information, and they had a simple rule that guided every financial decision they made. Never let your survival depend on one institution, one account, or one system that can be frozen without your permission. Their approach did not involve complicated formulas, and it involved spreading cash into several forms that behaved differently under stress. That approach became known among cautious investors as the 1929 strategy, and its logic still works in our century. A portion of their money stayed in everyday accounts for paying wages, bills, and small purchases because life had to continue. Another portion left the banking system completely and sat in heavy envelopes of physical notes hidden inside homes and businesses. Those envelopes were not there for fashion, and they were a direct answer to one brutal question about access. If the bank doors never opened again tomorrow, how many days could your family still eat, sleep, and travel without panic? Families who asked that question early kept enough currency for several weeks of food, rent, fuel, and other basic survival costs. The denominations were small so that any shopkeeper could accept them, even when nobody trusted checks or transfers. Some families added another layer by holding short-dated notes issued by the National Treasury instead of leaving everything on deposit. When commercial banks collapsed, those government obligations kept paying interest, and investors continued receiving envelopes from the Treasury itself. These pieces of paper were boring when times were good, yet they kept light and heat flowing when credit froze. People who owned them could sell a few on the open market and turn them into cash when neighbors were desperate. The important detail was that these notes were obligations of the state rather than promises of a single vulnerable bank. Wealthy households also used strong boxes and private vault rooms that did not belong to any lending institution in their city. Inside, they stored important documents, jewelry, emergency currency, and sometimes foreign banknotes that were not affected by local failures. When domestic branches closed, they still had something negotiable in their hands, while others waited weeks for official statements. Many older Europeans living in America kept a habit that had survived wars, revolutions, and older financial panics back home. They owned gold coins outright, and they treated them as a final reserve that would never be left on deposit anywhere. Those coins did not pay regular income, yet they bought food, passages, and even farmland when frightened sellers wanted certainty. In 1931, when additional banks failed, people with a handful of gold pieces could move across borders easily. Paper checks from closed institutions were worthless, yet a small leather pouch of yellow metal still opened doors and bargains. Ordinary families without access to vaults used a simpler variation that was just as powerful for getting through the worst months. They quietly turned part of their cash into goods that neighbors would always need, such as flour, coal, oilcloth, and tools. When branches stopped paying out bills, those households traded supplies and favors, while other people sold furniture just to buy groceries. A pantry full of basics acted like another bank account that no manager could close and no stock crash could erase. Many neighbors watched those prepared households with a mixture of envy and confusion because the preparation had looked unnecessary before. They had believed bank statements and government speeches more than their own common sense about how fragile promises can be. They assumed diversification meant owning different stocks while forgetting that all those shares still settled through the same banking pipes. They trusted that salaries would always arrive on schedule, and they never asked what would happen if payroll accounts froze. When the crisis finally hit, they learned that access beats return because yield is useless when you cannot withdraw. Some tried to correct years of neglect in an afternoon, and they found doors locked before they reached the counter. Others discovered that records of ownership were stored only inside the very institutions that had just failed without any backup. The few who had copied documents, stored deeds, and kept small ledgers at home were able to prove claims later. History rewarded the boring people who spent weekends organizing cash metals, papers and supplies instead of chasing stock stories. That pattern repeats in every era, including ours, because screens and slogans change, but human behavior matches 1929. Most watchers later called those families lucky because they did not see the boring preparation that created the outcome. Luck mattered far less than habit since they had practiced moving money and supplies before any headline mentioned crisis. Their nerves were still tested, but they did not have to beg strangers to release their own savings. Contrast that picture with the customer whose entire life sat on a single frozen account linked to a plastic card. Once the electricity failed or the bank app crashed, his apparent wealth shrank to whatever coins lay in his pocket. The 1929 strategy exists so your options during that moment are wider than counting change at the counter. It turns a crash from an instant personal catastrophe into a hard season that you can still navigate deliberately. The 1929 strategy was never about hiding in a cave, and it was about building several doors to money. If one door slammed shut, there was always another door, sometimes smaller, yet still open enough to walk through with dignity. One door led to cash in multiple banks, chosen for their boring stability, rather than their advertising or impressive buildings. Another door led to quietly stored currency at home, ready for blackouts, network failures, or sudden withdrawal limits announced overnight. A third door led to claims on the Treasury itself, where repayment depended on the tax power of an entire nation. A fourth door led to hard money in the form of coins and bullion that ignored speeches from bankers and politicians. A fifth door led to cupboards, fuel tanks, gardens, and workshops that turned stored effort into food warmth and repair. Today, the names on buildings and phone screens have changed, yet the weak points of the system remain hauntingly similar. Banks still lend aggressively during booms, and they still depend on borrowers never defaulting all at once in bad years. Governments still reassure the public that everything is safe right up to the morning when emergency press conferences appear. You cannot control those promises, yet you can decide whether all of your purchasing power lives under one fragile roof. If you follow the spirit of 1929, your cash plan begins not with interest rates, but with access. Ask yourself how much money you would need if card networks died for a week, yet shops still accepted paper. Ask how you would pay rent and fuel if your main bank suddenly added withdrawal limits for reasons beyond your control. Ask whether any part of your savings would still exist if an entire country issued new currency and froze old balances. Then slowly build a structure where each of those questions has a calm answer instead of a desperate guess. That structure might include several modest accounts across different cautious institutions rather than one impressive digital brand on your phone. It might include a safe place at home where a sealed envelope of notes waits untouched unless real trouble arrives. It might include a direct relationship with government debt markets where short-dated obligations act as a solid high ground. It might include a small stack of metal that does not vanish when software crashes or currencies are redesigned by decree. It might include stored supplies that let your family coast through a temporary shutdown without standing in fear outside darkened branches. None of these pieces are glamorous and none of them promise easy profit, and together they answer the question, where now? Where should cash live if banks fail? And the honest answer is that it should never live in only one place. The people who survived 1929 with options did not trust shiny counters, and they trusted structures they had built themselves. You can build your own version quietly long before any crisis headlines appear, and the work will feel boring and slow. Boring is exactly what you want when banks fail, because excitement only belongs to those who waited too long to prepare. If you want more strategies drawn from real history instead of marketing slogans, stay with Empire and Money for the next chapter.